My name is Albert. I am 70 years old. The first shovel of dirt had barely hit my brother's casket when my daughter-in-law Clara leaned in close, her breath a sickening mix of cheap perfume and spite. "Now it's your turn to leave," she whispered, her eyes, usually so cold, glinting with a morbid satisfaction. "The house, the land, everything. You're next on the list, old man." The world, already a muted grey from grief, seemed to tilt. This wasn't a private jab. It was a performance. She'd made sure of it. My sons, Michael and Diego, stood a few feet away, their faces a blank canvas of indifference. They'd heard her, I knew it. They'd heard every syllable of her cruel prophecy. The other mourners, the few who were left, shot us furtive, uncomfortable glances. My brother, my lifelong companion, was being laid to rest, and in the shadow of his passing, I was being told to prepare for my own. My heart, a weary old engine, seized for a moment. This wasn't grief. This was a public humiliation, a calculated strike delivered at the lowest moment of my life. My own son's wife, a woman I had welcomed into my home, was trying to bury me alongside my brother. Clara's words, sharp as shards of glass, had ripped through the solemnity of the funeral. But the real cut was the silence that followed. My sons, Michael and Diego, stood there, their hands in their pockets, their eyes fixed on the distant horizon, as if a flock of birds was more interesting than their father's public disgrace. It wasn't just Clara's cruelty that wounded me. It was their apathy. My boys, whom I had taught to be men of honor and decency, had become complicit in my humiliation. They had chosen her side, the side of cold-hearted calculation, over their own father. Later that evening, after a somber and silent wake, Clara and Michael approached me in the living room. Diego had already retreated to his family's room, a coward's exit. Clara, with her usual predatory smile, handed me an envelope. "Dad," Michael began, his voice devoid of any warmth, "we've talked it over. We think it's time you moved out. The house is too big for you." I stared at him, unable to comprehend the betrayal in his words. This wasn't a suggestion. It was an eviction notice. Clara stood beside him, her arms crossed, her expression a mix of triumph and impatience. The envelope in my hand felt heavy, like a stone. It contained a neatly typed letter, a formal request for me to vacate the property, signed by both of my sons. I couldn't believe what I was reading. It was a legal document, a declaration of war. My own flesh and blood, the boys I had raised to be good men, were kicking me out of the home I had built for them. My hands trembled, not from age, but from a profound and gut-wrenching shock. I looked from the paper to their faces, searching for some flicker of the boys I knew, the boys who once looked up to me. There was nothing, just the cold, hard stares of two strangers. "We've already found a place for you," Clara said, her voice dripping with false concern. "A nice little assisted living facility. It's much safer for you, Albert. You're getting old." I looked at her, at the woman who had poisoned my sons against me, and then at Michael, who couldn't meet my gaze. This wasn't about my safety or my age. This was about the house, the land, the assets I had worked my entire life for. They weren't my sons anymore. They were my vultures. That night, sleep was impossible. The silence of the house, a place once filled with laughter and love, was now a tomb of betrayal. I felt a strange, cold resolve crystallize within me. They wanted a fight, I would give them one. I would show them that the old man they so eagerly dismissed still had a few tricks up his sleeve. But first, I had to understand how this had happened. How had my family, my legacy, become so twisted? I had to find out what truly motivated this cruel, heartless coup. My wife, Laura, had been the heart of our home. Her sudden passing 5 years ago had left a gaping hole, a wound that never truly healed. It was after her death that I started to notice the cracks in my family. Clara, Michael's wife, had always been ambitious, but now, with Laura gone, her ambition turned into a ruthless greed. She began to treat me not as her father-in-law, but as an obstacle. Her subtle manipulations had been so gradual, so insidious, that I barely noticed them at first. Little comments about my health, my memory, my ability to manage the house. She was planting seeds of doubt, not just in my sons' minds, but in my own. I had always been a man of simple pleasures. My life revolved around my family, my work, and the land I had inherited from my father. I was a farmer, and I took pride in the rich soil and the sprawling fields that stretched as far as the eye could see. This land, this house, it was more than just property. It was the story of my family. It was where my boys had grown up, where my wife and I had built a life. I had always planned to pass it on to Michael and Diego, to let them continue the legacy. But now, it seemed, they were no longer interested in the legacy. They were only interested in the inheritance. The next morning, I confronted Diego. He was in the kitchen, nursing a cup of coffee, his face a mask of shame. "Diego," I said, my voice low and steady, "what is this? Why are you doing this to me?" He wouldn't look at me. He just stared into his coffee cup as if it held all the answers. "Dad, it's for the best," he mumbled, his voice weak and pathetic. "The property is a lot of work. You shouldn't have to deal with it anymore." His words were hollow, a parroting of Clara's script. "Is that what you really think, son? Or is that what Clara told you to say?" I pressed. He didn't answer. His silence was the loudest confession. He was a coward, a man who had chosen the path of least resistance, a man who would throw his own father out of his home to appease his manipulative wife. I left the kitchen, my heart heavy with a new kind of sorrow. It wasn't just grief for my brother or the betrayal of my sons. It was the crushing realization that the family I had built, the life I had worked so hard for, was a fragile thing, built on a foundation of shifting loyalties and ungrateful hearts. The love I had poured into my sons, the sacrifices I had made for them, all of it seemed to have meant nothing. As I walked past the open door of the study, I saw Clara on the phone, a triumphant smirk on her face. She was talking to someone about the property, and I heard her mention a developer and a new deal. A cold dread washed over me. This wasn't about me moving to an assisted living facility. This was about them selling off my family's land. But for what? The pieces were beginning to fall into place, but I still couldn't see the full picture. What was Clara's end game, and how much had my sons truly been roped into this scheme? The next few days were a blur of cold shoulders and whispered conversations. My sons and their families treated me like a ghost haunting my own home. They avoided my gaze, spoke in hushed tones, and left rooms the moment I entered. I felt like a prisoner in my own house, a man awaiting his final sentence. I realized that if I was going to fight them, I needed to understand the full scope of their plan. I had to find proof, something tangible that exposed their greed and their true intentions. My first thought was the old study. It was a room I had rarely used since Laura passed, a place of dusty books and old memories. But I remembered an old desk in the corner, a beautiful antique my father had owned. It had a series of small, hidden drawers that my father had shown me when I was a boy. He'd always said a man should have a few secrets, and a few places to keep them. I knew my sons, with their modern sensibilities and lack of patience for old things, would never think to look there. I waited until everyone was asleep, the house silent except for the creaks and groans of an old home settling in for the night. I crept into the study, the moonlight casting long, ghostly shadows across the room. The old desk stood in the corner, a silent witness to generations of my family's history. I ran my fingers along the smooth, worn wood, a wave of nostalgia washing over me. With a deep breath, I began to search for the hidden levers my father had shown me. I pushed a small, almost invisible button on the side, and a tiny drawer popped out with a soft click. Inside, there were a few faded photographs of my grandparents, a tarnished silver locket, and a small, leather-bound notebook. It wasn't the notebook that caught my eye, though. It was the letter tucked beneath it. A letter in my father's familiar, looping handwriting, addressed to me. I hadn't known he'd left it for me. I had assumed all his papers were in the safe. The letter was a treasure trove of information. It detailed the history of the land, the original deeds, and a number of legal documents I had never seen before. But what sent a jolt of ice through my veins was the last paragraph. "My dearest Albert," it read, "I've made arrangements for the land to stay in our family, a trust that ensures it cannot be sold for a profit by anyone other than you. I've seen the greed in your brother's eyes, and I worry it may one day be in your son's. I hope you never have to use this, but if you do, these documents will protect you." There were legal papers, a last will and testament, and a trust. The trust stipulated that the land could only be sold with my explicit consent, and even then, a significant portion of the profits would be donated to a local charity my father had supported. This was a legal fire extinguisher to a fire I didn't even know was being lit. I clutched the papers in my hand, my heart pounding in my chest. The betrayal from my sons and Clara now had a name: financial conspiracy. They weren't just trying to kick me out. They were trying to bypass my father's legal stipulations to sell the land for a huge profit. My father had foreseen this. He had seen the greed that lurked in the heart of our family, and he had protected me, even from beyond the grave. My anger, a slow-burning ember, now flared into a white-hot fire. I knew what I had to do. I had to use these documents to expose them, to protect my father's legacy, and to take back my home. But first, I had to find a lawyer, and I had to do it without them knowing I was one step ahead of their game. The following morning, I feigned a sudden bout of back pain. "It's my old age catching up with me," I said, a theatrical sigh escaping my lips. Clara, ever the master of her craft, immediately offered to drive me to the doctor. I knew she was just trying to control my movements. I agreed, but made sure to pack the old documents in a satchel I rarely used. It was a small, almost insignificant detail, but I knew she wouldn't suspect a thing. On the way to the clinic, I directed her to a different part of town. "There's a specialist I've been meaning to see," I lied, my voice filled with a convincing weariness. "He's an old friend of your late grandpa's." Clara, not wanting to seem unhelpful, didn't question it. The specialist was really my old friend, a brilliant lawyer named David, who had been my family's counsel for decades. He was a kind man, with a keen mind and an even keener sense of justice. When we arrived, Clara insisted on coming in with me. "I want to be there to make sure you tell him everything, Albert," she said, her smile not reaching her eyes. I smiled back, a calm, grandfatherly smile that masked the fury boiling beneath the surface. "Of course, dear," I said, "I have nothing to hide." In the waiting room, I subtly removed a small notepad from my satchel, placing it conspicuously on the table. It was a distraction. I knew Clara, with her obsessive need to control everything, would be watching my every move. As she leaned over to see what I was writing, a staged gasp of pain from me was enough for her to rush to my side. While she was distracted, I slipped the old leather-bound notebook and the legal papers out of my satchel and into the waiting room's magazine rack, just behind an old issue of National Geographic. It was a small risk, but a necessary one. When we were finally called in, I told David everything, or at least everything I wanted Clara to hear. I complained about my back, my failing memory, my inability to manage the house. Clara sat beside me, nodding along, a satisfied smirk on her face. But as I spoke, I would subtly glance at David, using a series of hand gestures only he and I would understand. It was a game we had played since our childhoods, a form of secret communication we had perfected over the years. I was telling him a different story, the real story, the one about the betrayal and the old documents. I told him about my suspicions, my son's coldness, and the discovery of my father's will. David, a master of his craft, played along perfectly. He spoke in hushed tones, his brow furrowed in concern. "Yes, Albert," he said, patting my hand, "I think we should do a full medical workup. We'll get a second opinion on your memory, too. It's always best to be thorough." Clara seemed thrilled. She thought she was winning. She thought I was finally admitting defeat. But as we were leaving, I caught David's eye. He gave me a barely perceptible nod, a signal that he understood. I knew he was going to get those documents, and I knew he was going to read them. He had agreed to help me. Now, the real game began. My next move had to be carefully calculated. I had to get back home, and I had to make sure my sons and their wives didn't find out about the documents, or about my plans. The clock was ticking, and I knew that if I didn't act fast, I might lose everything. But what could I do? Back at the house, I was a changed man. I pretended to be defeated, a frail old man resigned to his fate. I walked with a slight limp, my shoulders slumped, my voice a soft, tired whisper. Clara, Michael, and Diego all seemed to relax. Their predatory instincts were satisfied. They thought they had broken me. That night, at the dinner table, a rare moment of family unity, Clara brought up the assisted living facility again. "The paperwork is almost ready, Albert," she said, her voice a sickly sweet melody of false sympathy. "The place is lovely. They have a garden and a pool." I just nodded, a mournful sigh escaping my lips. "A garden sounds nice," I said, my voice barely audible. "I suppose I'll need to start packing some of my things." Michael and Diego exchanged a look of relief. They thought the battle was over. They thought they had won. I watched them, my heart a cold stone in my chest. They didn't see the silent fire in my eyes, the quiet fury that was growing with every passing second. The next day, I asked Michael to help me with something in the attic. The attic was a labyrinth of forgotten treasures, dusty memories, and old furniture. It was the perfect place for a conversation to be unheard. As he was helping me lift a heavy trunk, I looked him in the eye. "Son," I said, my voice low and serious, "your grandfather's old desk. I want you to have it. It's a family heirloom." Michael looked surprised, a rare emotion on his face. "Really, Dad? I've always liked that desk." "It's yours," I said, "but there's something you should know. Your grandfather, he had a secret drawer in there. I don't know what's in it, but I always felt it was meant for you. It was a lie, a carefully constructed web of deceit, but I knew it would work." I was playing on his greed, his curiosity, and his desire to have something his brother didn't. I watched his eyes light up, not with love or affection, but with a greedy glint. I knew he would go to the desk, and I knew he would find nothing. But, in the process, he would be the one to open the desk, and therefore, I could subtly plant my own legal documents and watch as he took the bait. What I was doing was dangerous. I was not only exposing their greed, but also subtly driving a wedge between the two brothers. I knew this would cause a huge blow to their already fractured relationship, but I had to do it. It was the only way to get a confession. Michael, eager to get his hands on the inheritance, would surely take the bait, and then I would be in a better position to face Clara. But would he confess? Or would he find a way to make it seem like he was doing nothing wrong? Michael, a man who had always been more interested in money than sentiment, took the bait hook, line, and sinker. That evening, he disappeared into the study for a suspiciously long time. I could hear the muffled sounds of a frantic search, the creaking of the old desk, and the soft thud of things being moved around. I waited. The silence that followed was even more telling than the noise. He had found nothing, but the seed of doubt, the idea of a hidden treasure, had been planted. I knew what would come next. He would share this secret with Clara, and they would start their own search, a frantic, desperate attempt to find what they thought was there. The next morning, I confronted Clara. She was in the kitchen, a triumphant grin on her face. "You look happy, Clara," I said, my voice calm. She spun around, the smile faltering for a second. "Oh, Albert, I was just thinking about the new place. I'm sure you'll be much happier there." I smiled back, a cold, empty smile. "I'm sure I will," I said, "but first, I have a few things to take care of." I pulled out a manila envelope from my pocket and placed it on the counter. Clara's eyes immediately went to the envelope. Her greed was a visible thing, a physical hunger. "What's this?" she asked, her voice a little too eager. "Oh, just some papers I found," I said, feigning an old man's forgetfulness. "I think it's a will of some sort." Clara snatched the envelope, her eyes scanning the documents inside. Her face, a mask of composure, began to crumble. The documents were a forgery, a brilliant piece of work created by David. They were designed to look like the legal papers for a property trust, but with a crucial difference. They stated that the land could only be sold if all legal inheritors agreed to the sale. But they also had a clause that if any inheritor was found to have acted maliciously or with fraudulent intent, they would forfeit their share. It was a trap, and Clara was walking right into it. She looked up at me, her face pale, a look of pure, unadulterated fear in her eyes. "This can't be right," she stammered. This is impossible." I just watched her, a silent witness to her undoing. The lie I had told Michael, the fake documents, everything was coming together. Suddenly, a loud crash came from the study. We both ran to the room, where we found Michael and Diego standing amidst a pile of books and papers. The old desk, the very one I had told Michael about, was in pieces. "We were just trying to find the rest of the papers, Dad," Michael blurted out, his face flushed with guilt. Diego, ever the coward, just stood there, his eyes wide with fear. "Papers for what?" I asked, my voice as cold as ice. Clara, her composure completely gone, yelled at me. "The papers for the trust, you old fool. The ones you found." It was the confession I had been waiting for. But there was still one more piece to the puzzle, one more shocking discovery that would reveal the true depth of their greed and betrayal, and it was hidden in plain sight, in a place they would never think to look. The tension in the room was thick enough to cut with a knife. My sons, their faces a mixture of shame and fury, stood amidst the wreckage of the old desk. Clara, her eyes darting between me and the destroyed furniture, was a cornered animal. "What papers, Clara?" I said, my voice now a steel blade. "What are you talking about?" My feigned ignorance was the final blow. It broke her. "The papers for the trust," she screamed. "The ones you found. The ones that say we can't sell the land. She then made a quick accusation to my sons. It was Michael's idea. He's the one who found the papers from his grandpa. Michael and Diego's faces were a mix of anger and shock. They looked at their wives, and then at me. It was clear they thought I was a senile old man who had stumbled upon something important without realizing it. But I wasn't. I had been playing them all along. I walked past the wreckage of the desk, past my astonished sons, and over to the bookshelf. I reached up to a small, unassuming volume of Shakespeare, and with a soft click, a false back opened. Inside, nestled amongst a stack of old photos, was the original last will and testament of my father. I pulled it out, and the room went silent. "What's that, Dad?" Diego asked, his voice a whisper. "This," I said, holding up the document, "is the real will. The one your grandfather wrote." I handed it to them. They read it, their eyes wide with disbelief. It was the same as the one I had found, the one that stipulated the land could not be sold. Clara, her face now a sickening shade of white, lunged for the paper. "That's a fake," she screamed, but it was too late. I had already called David, who, with my permission, had sent an official notice to their lawyers. A formal declaration that he represented me and that he had secured the original documents. A few days later, my sons came to me. They were apologetic, their faces etched with a profound shame. They had been manipulated by Clara, they said. They had been fooled by her greed. I looked at them, at the two men who had tried to kick me out of my own home, and a profound sadness washed over me. I couldn't forgive them. Not completely. I told them that the house was mine, and that they would have to find their own place to live. The house, the land, it was all mine again. The trust was clear, and my sons had no claim to it. The poetic justice of it all was beautiful. My father, in his wisdom, had saved me. His love for me, his foresight, had protected me from the very people who were supposed to care for me. My sons and their wives were left with nothing. They had gambled on my death and my supposed frailty, and they had lost everything. They were forced to leave the property, and as Clara was being driven away in a taxi, I looked her in the eye. I didn't say a word. I just smiled, a smile of triumphant peace. And in her defeated face, I saw a profound understanding. She knew that I had one. And she knew that my family's land would never be hers. The land, and my story, had finally found its rightful owner.